Hello there, John Coturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode, and as usual, thank you to everyone who makes my work possible. Today's episode is going to upset some people. I recognise that in advance, and it's certainly not my intention, so I implore you all, if you are listening, please listen to everything that I have to say. Please listen to the entire episode and listen with intent to all of the details, because this is something that everybody needs to hear, and every detail is going to count here. In the past, I have discussed the irrationalities of politics as a general phenomenon, and I've explained why it's such a mentally corrupted and, quite frankly, evil game of life. But in today's episode, I'm going to be examining stereotypical political schools of thought, so to speak, and discussing the specific logical inconsistencies of each. And when I refer to stereotypical schools of thought, I'm talking about generically the left-wing or progressive side of politics and the right-wing or conservative side of politics. Now, before we begin, let's make some points especially clear. What I'm going to be doing here is not advising you to change your views, because ultimately, as I always say, you are responsible for what you believe and what you do, so you take this information for what it's worth, and you use it as you know is responsible. It's not an insult to people or to specific groups. As I'm going to discuss, the human race does have a tendency to become very emotionally attached to its beliefs, and to think that just because somebody is criticizing their beliefs, that they're necessarily being criticized personally. So I must emphasize, regardless of what you may think, this is not an insult to people. I'm also not going to be assuming that every view in each of these schools of thought necessarily applies to every person who identifies with that school of thought. A lot of people are going to be saying, well, I identify as a progressive or a conservative. I don't believe that. I recognize that. By and large, these types of beliefs tend to be associated with these particular schools of thought, but I recognize that a person is not their beliefs, and a person is not a school of thought. They are an individual. They have their own set of values, their own set of qualities. So again, do not take it personally if you hear something with which you disagree or which you don't believe applies to you, because that is quite a possibility. I'm acknowledging it right now. Political beliefs are often perpetuated by people with the wrong intentions, but by and large, there are plenty of people on the ground, that is to say people who are just living their lives as the average person does and just trying to make sense of the world in the best way that they can. There are plenty of people who identify as progressives and conservatives who have the best of intentions. They're trying to make sense of the world, they're trying to live their lives as best they can, and they're trying to do what's right by other people. So if I disagree with or criticize a particular belief which you hold, it's not to say that you have the wrong intentions. It's not to say that you're a bad person. And especially importantly, it's not to say that any negative consequences resulting from any of these beliefs are your fault. As I'm going to be making clear, often the real impact of these beliefs has nothing to do with people who are just bystanders thinking that those beliefs are valid. It's the people who actually invent them for their own benefits. Those are the people who are often responsible for a lot of these problems. People can inadvertently contribute to problems, but again, I'm acknowledging that because I know that a lot of people do have good intentions. So it's not an insult to your character as an individual if we criticize something here. I am going to be expressing these ideas rather strongly because in the real world, fanaticism or fundamentalist beliefs in particular ideas that are by and large invented by us, which I'm going to discuss in just a minute, do lead to destruction. You don't need to watch the news for long to learn that all over the world, destruction happens as a direct result of political beliefs. If we are to make an impact and avoid destruction, then ultimately we have to take responsibility. We need to discuss these ideas, even if they're uncomfortable, even if it is to criticize them, and to bring us to a point where we can admit where we may be making cognitive mistakes. Also, let me emphasize, nothing in this episode, in fact, nothing that I produce in any of my episodes is fanaticism. It is not support of particular political figures, politicians, journalists, other people, etc. It's not support for a particular political belief. It's not support for any other entities. Allow me to remind you, as I have discussed in the past, politics is not natural. Nature did not invent us and assign us to different political beliefs, or any beliefs for that matter. Nature gave us a specific set of needs and gave us the means to evolve so that we could meet those needs. Politics and other similar belief systems, unfortunately, are a distortion of evolutionary needs. As I've discussed in the past, because we are constantly dealing with different demands of our environment, our brains have actually evolved to try to make quick decisions about what to think and what to do. It's called heuristic thinking, taking mental shortcuts, so to speak. And when our minds are constantly trying to make quick decisions, sometimes what happens is we develop entire systems of belief designed to give us a simple explanation of how the world works, but ultimately consisting of beliefs that are not true or that are extremely distorted. Politics over history has evolved for that reason, because we want to feel like we know the truth about how the world works. We want to feel supported by having people around us who believe as we believe, but reality does not fit into political beliefs. You cannot say, I am progressive and I know the truth about everything, or I'm conservative, I know the truth about everything. Because if you bind yourself to a set of beliefs, there is almost inevitably going to be either untruths or distorted ideas in those beliefs, because nothing that is invented by the human mind can possibly be as objective and unbiased as it needs to be in order to perceive objective reality. It can't be as complex as nature either. Nature and reality are objective phenomena. They exist in and of themselves, and then we can only try our best to explain them. We are always going to distort them in some way when we perceive them. Just because I believe something that is coincidentally also believed by, say, a majority of progressives or a majority of conservatives does not mean I am a progressive or a conservative, nor does it mean the same for anyone. I analyse each issue in and of itself. I try to collect as much evidence as I can from the real world. I make tentative evaluations about what the most logical answer to a particular question or a particular problem might be. So any alignment that anything that I believe to be true with particular political beliefs has nothing to do with my support of those political beliefs. As I've said in the past, I do not support politicians, I do not support politics. I support trying to discover truth. I admit that I cannot know the truth about everything. I admit that I make cognitive mistakes, even if I'm unaware of it. But this is why I make these sorts of analyses, to show you just how distorted belief systems can be. And through that, I can also guarantee you what I do is not for money or support, and it's not to be inflammatory. If you are offended by anything, I can guarantee you that is not my intention. You do not get popular, I will remind you, by telling people what they need to hear or trying to be objective. You get popular by telling people what they want to hear, by appealing to their emotions. I'm not trying to appeal to anyone's emotions. I'm trying to show you objectively how distorted our thinking can be, but also where the opportunity is for us to examine our own thinking and perhaps correct it when we have the opportunity. There is also an argument amongst particular political advocates that the argument that both sides of politics are equally bad is a lazy argument. People say, well, if you think that both sides are equally bad, then you can't be bothered to do your own research. Clearly one side is better. I'm not intellectually lazy, and I'm not scared to speak what I believe to be the truth or undecided. On many matters, I am quite decided about what I believe to be objectively true. It actually takes more intellectual effort to do what I'm doing now than it does to take a side, because when you bind yourself to a particular belief system, without even realizing it, your adherence to that belief system is actually distorting how you absorb information to which you are exposed in the future. Without even realizing it, you are actually limiting how you take the information and distorting how you take the information purely by seeing it through the lens of that belief system rather than trying to see it objectively. It takes far more effort mentally to analyze each issue in and of itself and decide what you believe to be the most objective answer. A lot of you are going to be also noticing that I cannot possibly cover in this episode every problem or every logical fallacy in the stereotypical left and right of politics. They're broad schools of thought. There are a lot of issues that pertain to both. I'm also not prescribing here what I believe to be the answer. Just because I criticize something as a logical inconsistency or say that a particular belief from one of the schools of thought has irrationalities or flaws in it, it's not to say that I don't think it's important. And it's not to say that I necessarily even disagree with that particular point of view. It's not even to say that I know the answer. What I'm focusing on here is the areas in which people who support each stereotypical side are willing to apply the logic when it suits them, but then ignore the logic when it suits them in order to maintain adherence to their beliefs. I'm mainly focusing on the inconsistencies. In fact, each of those problems that I'm going to discuss, either I have discussed them in previous episodes and analysed them in detail, or I'm going to discuss them in future episodes. But problems this complex need their own analysis. So in today's episode, I'm going to be focusing on where the inconsistencies are. As we discuss this, what you'll notice is that all ideologies essentially have the same types of psychological flaws. As I said, all ideologies are essentially invented for the purpose of trying to give us the reassurance that we know what objective reality is. It's for us to have a sense of assurance that we know the truth if we just stick to these beliefs. People want to feel that they're right. It's one of our natural inclinations. And we also want to feel like we're part of something bigger, a group. But all belief systems are tainted by biases. Biases are mental tendencies in how we process information that prevent the ideas that we accept from being completely objective. What tends to happen, though, is that especially the strong proponents of different belief systems tend to engage in the same types of intellectual dishonesty. They tend to, for example, take examples of specific events or behavior of people from the other side, so to speak, without evidence of whether those events or behaviors are isolated, maybe just applying to those people, or whether they actually are systematic and occur throughout society. And they conclude, based on that limited evidence, you see, this is what the other side wants for society. So they'll argue with insufficient evidence that they know what the other side thinks, feels, and what they want. There is bullying that happens on both sides. People do make fun of the other side, saying they lack intelligence, and they'll often downplay the importance of issues expressed by the other side. But what you'll often notice is that especially the vocal proponents, the people who, for example, have their own media programs, people on the internet, they will create content just to laugh at and disparage people of different beliefs. And they'll make comments that consist of nothing more than personal opinions. If it was true that the other side really lacked intelligence, then these pundits being people who sell ideas, these pundits would want to show that they are intellectually superior, but they never do. They never show intellectual superiority. They show themselves just expressing personal opinions without proper intellectual analysis. Often what happens is when you take a pundit aside and you try to empathize with them and you try to specify where their cognitive mistakes are and why they should care about the issues that the other side expresses, when they're cornered in those moments intellectually, they tend to concede and say, well, yes, I do acknowledge that this is a real problem. I do care, I'm just telling people what they need to hear. But an intellectually honest mind doesn't wait for someone to say that to them before they acknowledge that an issue is important. They will do it out of good faith for the sake of being truthful. The fact that people from given sides of politics tends to only focus on issues that they claim are caused by the other side, which is often a narrow selection of the issues that exist in the world, demonstrates that they have been brainwashed or are themselves doing the brainwashing for the purpose of being consistent with their side because it benefits them. And again, when somebody else does raise concern about the fact that other issues exist, often they'll either minimize their importance or make excuses for why that's not an issue of our side, that's an issue of the other side, trying to make arguments about why the other side caused it. And of course, people of all sides like to think that it's the people on the other side of the spectrum that are oppressing them. Everyone believes themselves to be a victim. The term critical thinking is thrown around rather loosely in politics and these types of belief systems. People tend to say the other side doesn't think critically, but we do. But then, when you have the same types of cognitive flaws, how can you say that your thinking is actually more critical? Further to that, even amongst particular political schools of thought, the right and the left, those two sides do get divided into subgroups that actually fight amongst each other. And a lot of those groups say of other groups, they're not true progressives or conservatives, but we are. And often, rather interestingly, the people of each subgroup will often say that they don't stand with people in the other subgroups who commit misconduct, for example, make death threats of other people. But they do characterize all people on the other side as being bad just by the acts that some people do. The only real question that you have to ask to dismantle all this logic is, if everybody believes that their opinion is equally correct, but each person's evidence is no stronger than anyone else's, even if they think it is, then how can any one person say they're correct? And what perhaps is worse is that sometimes people from one side do commit misconduct and their peers will say, well, we acknowledge that they did something wrong, but because of so much of the good work that they do, we can let it go. Very clearly, a lot of these tactics are not for the purpose of trying to find truth. They're people trying to win the argument because that makes them feel strong. And often people don't even realize they're doing it. They're being indoctrinated by the people who control them. Something that you'll also notice is that when I talk about the proponents of these particular beliefs, I will often be referring to what we may call personalities. Journalists, politicians, other people in the media, corporate executives, people who have a presence in society and whose job is essentially, they essentially make their money from selling ideas. That's because a lot of these ideas come from pundits. They come from people whose entire livelihood is based on selling ideas. Often the people who believe them, the people on the street who have real jobs and who actually are contributing something to society on a daily basis, even if they do bind themselves to these ideologies, often they're not as culpable, if at all, for the effects of these ideologies because they're just trying to make sense of the world. They're just believing what they genuinely have a reason to believe is true. what you'll often find is that we are often less polarized in real life than the media and politicians want us to think. You see this in the media a lot. People saying, the people from the other side never want to engage in friendly debate. That's because they're intellectually dishonest. They want to censor us. And yet, I have met plenty of people in real life who might be from either side of politics or might have a particular philosophy with which I don't agree. And even though I don't agree, I'm willing to enter into respectful discussion with them, and they're willing to enter into respectful discussion with me. And we examine the epistemology, that is to say, the nature of the knowledge and the factual basis of these particular beliefs, and we can both critically examine them, and we can enter into that conversation without being aggressive or unkind towards one another. That demonstrates that in real life, human beings are capable of more than what we are being told we are capable of. We are capable of critical thinking. The vast majority of people seem to be open to discussion when it's done in good faith. It's only when the discussion is done in bad faith that they become defensive. We can have respectful discussion, and people are not as polarized in real life as they are in the media. So pay attention to these details as we're having the discussion here. Okay, now in our discussion of the separate schools of thought, we're going to start with progressive politics. And I must make a disclaimer here that this is not because I am more in favour of or against progressive politics. The reason I'm starting with progressive politics is because I had to start with one side, and I reasoned that seeing as progressive politics is what we call the left wing, and in the West we read from left to right, then it makes more sense to start with whatever is on the left. And I promise you that was the most objective way that I could decide how to start this discussion. But before we criticise any ideas, let's discuss a general understanding of the broad commonalities of how progressive politics functions. So progressive politics, as its main domain of focus, is facilitating in society the equitable access to resources needed for survival of all people. It posits that regardless of your race, your sex, your social status, your class membership, your particular economic identification, regardless of these characteristics, that you should have equal access to the basic resources that every human needs to survive. And this especially manifests in progressive initiatives to help people who are vulnerable or disadvantaged. For example, social welfare programs, laws that protect against inequity in hiring or the distribution of benefits, protection towards certain groups from hate crimes, redistribution of wealth through taxation to fund these different types of programs. And to support this, progressive politics often supports opposition to, or at least challenging, conventional social norms, beliefs, and structures. For example, those that dictate how people of certain sexes, cultures, or statuses should behave. And it tends to question whether these norms are actually objectively reflective of reality or whether they were constructed simply to benefit some groups whilst disadvantaging others. Now, there is a lot of truth in these ideas. Unfortunately, there are some problems that can manifest in the real-world implementation of progressive politics. One of the problems is that some progressive ideas, when taken to the extreme, can normalise avoidance as a coping mechanism. And that is to say, it tends to encourage people as a general life philosophy to simply try to find ways not to engage with challenges, rather than facing challenges and trying to strengthen one's own coping mechanisms. While we have to acknowledge that people have their limitations and that we shouldn't punish people for having limitations, at the same time, it may be a basis for people not to achieve their full potential as individuals. And when society accepts them at a greater level, then it's not in society's best interests either. Another particular problem is that progressivism tends to promote radical subjectivism. That means promoting as an absolute that there is no such thing as objective reality, there is no such thing as objective truth. Everything that we hold to be true has just been socially constructed, and so we can essentially change the structure of how society operates, and if we did it properly, in theory, it would not inhibit our ability to function. In fact, it may actually make society function better. I'm going to argue that this actually isn't true, that there are such things as objective truths, objective realities, and if we adhere to those objective realities and implement structures around them, then society actually functions more effectively and efficiently, as well as providing for better lives for the individuals involved in it. But this is a separate issue. We will discuss it briefly today. I will discuss it more in the future. Let's examine some of the common inconsistencies in progressivism. First of all, one of the key ideas that is born of progressivism as a result of the belief that the resources to survive should be distributed as equally as possible amongst people, regardless of their individual qualities or their status, is that capitalism is fundamentally evil. The argument here tends to be that often the people who get paid the most in society, or who have the most economic benefits distributed to them, are not necessarily the people who do the most for society, and not necessarily the people who work the hardest or who sacrifice the most. They're the people who are benefiting from their status, which has been assigned by society. And this is why you will often hear from the progressive side of politics criticisms of, say, corporate executives. People often say, well, they sit in their offices all day, they don't do a lot of work that produces a tangible outcome, but they get paid more than the people on the factory floor who are working and potentially sacrificing their well-being. Let's examine some of the broad classes of people who tend to support these ideas. As I said, personalities tend to be the types of people that are most vocal on these topics. Journalists, social media influencers, politicians, academics. How much do these people actually produce in terms of tangible benefit compared to, say, a tradesman or someone who has a more conventional job, like someone who is an accountant, a plumber, an electrician, a motor mechanic, a construction worker, a social worker, a doctor, a nurse, an optometrist? Any of these types of professions where the benefit that they produce is very directly linked to somebody else's life, to outcomes. Arguably, it's actually oxymoronic to say that any of these people who preach these ideas in these positions of privilege are actually truly progressive, because progressivism is against a class divide. It's against the perpetuation of systems that allow people to earn money purely based on status rather than based on the actual benefits to society that they provide. And yet look at, say, politicians. Politicians perpetuate a system that is indeed a class divide. There's politicians and then there's the rest of us. They hold power, they get a lot of money. Arguably they don't do as much work as they should given the money that they're paid. The rest of us are left to survive for ourselves. Also, let's look at people like what we may call influencers or thought leaders. They are very vocal on the rhetoric that they produce. Consumerism is bad. Societal ideals are sexist. Body shaming and diet culture is unrealistic. Don't compare yourselves to other people. Be happy in who you are. Be happy with what you have. But look at how they present themselves to the public, especially on social media. They are trying to sell you on the idea that they have a dream lifestyle. They're subtly trying to tell you, if you work as hard as I do, you'll have a dream lifestyle and have all this money and all these possessions that I absolutely love having. They never say it out loud, but that is the subtle idea that they're trying to convey to you. And then often there's subtext, if you buy my literature that will teach you how to be a successful person, you can have this too. Without telling you, as I've stated in the past, that there are no guarantees in life and that often people put everything on the line and then come out broke because they didn't properly calculate risk. Another issue here related to this is it's actually difficult to determine whether progressive subcultures actually exist outside of capitalist ideals. Now, I'm not suggesting that there are no such thing as vulnerable groups, or that vulnerable groups are just pretending to be vulnerable just so they can make money. But all too often, entities like government departments, politicians, corporations claim to preach progressive ideals, but they don't practice them in real life. Think about all the government departments and all the corporations that say we are friendly to this community or that community. How many of those bodies actually practice that philosophy? How many of them actually do something to help those individuals? Think about the horrible service that you might get from government departments, especially if you're a vulnerable person. Or think about the horrible service you might get from a large health organisation. If you're a vulnerable person and that's how they're treating you, then what does the slogan at the bottom of their website actually mean? It means absolutely nothing. And I really have to wonder whether out in the real world, out in the street, the average person who is a member of these vulnerable groups actually believes that these philosophies are in their best interests. I'm starting to wonder whether a lot of these philosophies or a lot of these catchphrases are invented by corporations and government departments to make vulnerable groups think that they care about them when in reality they don't. I've shared my experiences before of, for example, especially in the health industry, organisations that claim to care about the mentally ill, the disabled, the disadvantaged, but then they act in distinct ways that go against those groups' best interests. Also think about how many people with a personality, so to speak, like celebrities, how many of them preach that we should stand up for the little person, but actually don't get very much involved with the little person unless it's in front of the cameras to try and convince the public that they care. What's also of great concern is that there are also plenty of people who do morally license themselves with social justice ideologies, people who don't do what's in society's best interest but claim to support those ideologies because it gives them a sense of, yes, I'm a good person, see, I believe in something, who, for example, make classist judgments, or people who are willing to disparage the mentally ill or the disabled, people who mistreat animals people who drive dangerously even. I mean, one of the most basic ways you can care about society is by not doing anything dangerous on a daily basis. Another key tenet of progressive ideology is environmentalism. Again, the environment is extremely important. It's resilient, but we should not be complacent about that. We should be protecting our environment. There are plenty of instances in which people claim to care about the environment, but don't act in ways that demonstrate that. People are genuinely scared that they are going to be hurt in the future. They're not going to have a future because climate change will wipe out the human race. And yet a lot of these people are still heavily consumerist. They'll buy things they don't need. They produce more waste than is necessary to survive. They're not conscientious about how they use resources. And they'll actively admit, I want things, therefore I should have them. There are even people who have admitted to me, I would do something if the rest of society did, but because the rest of society doesn't do something about the environment, I don't see that I need to either. And another interesting point that's related here is that despite what we may think, not everyone who is against the evils of capitalism is necessarily left-wing. There are people who identify alternatively, free thinkers, people who are more conservative or libertarian, who do believe that corporations are selling us things we don't need, that governments and corporations are operating society in a way that disadvantages us. And a lot of these people also do care about the environment. A lot of these people go out into the country and they live off the land by growing their own produce, or they raise their own livestock. They may have their own generator, or they might use a solar setup. They might have their own water source. And often they will talk about exactly the same concerns, that corporations and governments are running our society in a way that disadvantages us because they want control. Progressive ideology and related ideologies like socialism are meant to be anti-authority. But then the minute that someone from an alternative standpoint, like, for example, the conservative side, advocates against capitalism and against corporate greed and says, yes, I agree with you, these entities are trying to control us, they get called a conspiracy theorist. Another key tenet of progressive politics is advocacy against oppression and violence and the misuse of authority. One of the key inconsistencies with both sides of politics is that really what separates them isn't whether they believe the government should control people's lives or not. It's what they believe the government should control. The left have their own things that they don't like, which they would like the government to ban. And the basis that they claim on which they should be banned is not scientifically valid often. Often there is advocacy of, for example, censorship, certain books, statues, even using certain words in public that might be offensive to certain groups. The left claim that in the name of science, if you ban these things, then you will eliminate hatred or at least alleviate it. As I'm about to explore in the section on science in just a minute, this is not true. And I can tell you, even if a politician claims to be progressive and claims to be banning things because it's in your best interests, it's never in your best interests. People don't take that level of control in society because they believe that it's in your best interests. They don't do it because they care about you. They do it because some people have a sick and unnatural desire for control over others. It is pure evil. And related to this, self-defense laws and the right to bear weapons for self-defense, this is a complex matter and not as much of an issue in Australia because in Australia the use of firearms for self-defense is effectively illegal, but over in places like the United States, where in many jurisdictions you can freely own a gun for self-defense and even carry it in public, there are many members of the left who are against that right and who say, the right are just scaredy cats, what do you need a gun for? What are you so scared of? But these same progressives will then tell you that society is one big oppressive machine and that danger lurks around every corner. Let me ask you something. If you genuinely believe that minorities and vulnerable groups are in danger, why wouldn't you want them armed, especially if you're one of those people who advocates defunding the police? If the police didn't exist hypothetically, how would you defend yourself? Threats are not going to stop existing. Another major issue is identity politics, and identity politics is a phenomenon by which people are judged according to their group membership. They're judged whether they should be given certain privileges or whether they should be treated as good or bad or treated well or with disrespect based on their membership of a particular group. Again, while progressivism tends to claim that it's not classist, identity politics is essentially equivalent to classism, and it is essentially a form of bigotry. It essentially argues that when you are a member of a particular group, then regardless of your individual behaviours, you are inherently contributing to certain problems or not contributing to certain problems. You inherently take the role of either an oppressor or a victim. And often it's argued that if you are a member of a majority group, then regardless of your individual behaviours, then merely by being a member of that majority group, unless you speak out against your fellow peers, you hold an imbalance of power and you will be treated with more privilege by society. Therefore, you have a duty to try to dismantle oppressive systems. And if you don't believe that, you're considered an oppressor. By comparison, if you're a member of a disadvantaged group, then you are assumed to always be a victim. And if you don't believe you're a victim, then you're called a sellout. You think this is exaggeration? I've seen it happen. I interviewed Ariana Kulikov some time ago. She transitioned from being female to being male and then detransitioned. There were people who told her that merely by the fact that she detransitioned, that she reversed the gender transitioning process, that she was a bigot for abandoning the trans community. The whole purpose of progressive philosophy is meant to be that as long as you're not hurting anyone else, you should not be judged. Now, if you wouldn't judge a trans person as a bad person purely for being trans, why would you judge someone who detransitions? That's not caring about individual people's rights. That's saying all I want is for people to be a member of my group and no one else's group. And that is the same type of bigotry that has occurred historically towards those minority and vulnerable groups. It's just practiced by different people, but the psychological underpinnings are exactly the same. People from different ethnic backgrounds who have migrated to Australia with very little to their name find success for themselves as business owners. And they've told me that members of their own ethnic community have called them sellouts. Basically what they've been told, not explicitly but by implication, is that if you genuinely cared about your peers, you would remain oppressed so that you could identify with them. Again, if you genuinely care about someone, how could you say that? Why not see them as a role model and say, you know what, that person came here with nothing. Maybe if they can be successful, maybe I can be successful too. It's not to say that your choices are the only factors that cause or don't cause you to be successful. There are complexities there, but what I'm saying is, why would you want to disparage someone for wanting to do what is necessary to survive? Why would you want someone else to be at a disadvantage? That's cruelty. And again, I don't think it's the majority of people, but the fact that this has actually existed, that this has actually happened, suggests that there are a lot of inconsistencies in how people practice these types of philosophies. And there are people who argue that privilege intersects. That means that the level of privilege you have can actually be complicated by your varying memberships of particular groups. To give an example, this philosophy would consider that a person on the street who is homeless and incredibly ill and basically has nothing to their name, extremely vulnerable, isn't necessarily as much of a victim as another type of person because they're white or they're a man. If you're on the street sick and have nothing to your name, whether you're white or black, you're in a pretty difficult situation, and when you're sleeping out on the street, there's nothing to protect you. This philosophy constantly tries to turn everything into some kind of nuanced argument whereby there's complexity. And whether you know it or not, you are either an oppressor or a victim. Really, without analysing the minutiae of how people live their lives, it is actually impossible to take 5 seconds of looking at someone to judge whether they're an oppressor or a victim. Whether you're an oppressor or a victim depends on your behaviours, your choices. And you cannot say that being a member of a group causes something to happen without examining the individual way that the person interacts with that group and interacts with the rest of society. That is incredibly unscientific. This overall does not lend itself to social justice. It doesn't really facilitate equitable distribution of benefits and people not being judged. It actually creates more judgment and more warfare between people of different political groups. The final tenet that we're going to discuss is how progressive politics tends to treat science. It tends to treat it as some kind of panacea. But the reality is that often a lot of people who quote science or who say the science says this or the science says that don't actually understand it, which is not their fault. We're not really taught to understand science properly in society, which again is largely a societal failing. But there are a number of scientific ideas that actually in many ways contradict what is considered to be true in progressivism. And progressivism doesn't tend to acknowledge it. Let's discuss the topic of science itself. One of the common arguments from identity politics is that a person should not comment on a particular issue unless they have experience. But a lot of people take the liberty of saying that science says something and judging people who don't agree with them without actually understanding how the science works. So they don't have experience, but they feel free to comment on the issue without acknowledging that maybe somebody else might have more experience. And in fact, often when scientists do make comment on issues in a way that contradicts progressive ideals and progressive rhetoric, they're insulted, even though they may actually have more knowledge and more experience than the people doing the insulting. Assuming scientists always have good intentions is blatantly false. All right? Historically speaking, people have been oppressed because the regime that oppresses them has claimed it's scientific. And people may argue, well, we live in more enlightened times now. As I have stated on many occasions, yes, we have improved in society in some ways, but human psychology has not evolved that much. People will continue to find ways to fulfill sick fantasies. Sometimes that means finding a way to get yourself into a position of power by studying something at university that will allow you to have that position so that you can control other people. People do misuse their power, and being a scientist does put you in a position of power. Now, if we're going to criticize people for being privileged, as progressives tend to, let's criticize people who do misuse privilege. Politicians, scientists who misuse their privilege, health professionals who misuse their privilege. They often do, and it goes undetected because people assume that scientists and educated folk always have the right intentions. There's also a rather smug tendency that I've seen amongst progressives to advocate for what we call Hanlon's razor. And Hanlon's razor is a philosophical principle that states that we shouldn't attribute somebody's behaviour to malice when it could be attributed to stupidity or incompetence. Let's assume that that was actually true. It's not, but let's assume it's true. When someone disagrees with the science, so to speak, and gets called a conspiracy theorist by someone, that's rather disparaging. If someone disagrees with science and you genuinely believe that Hanlon's razor is truthful, why are you assuming that they're a bad person? In other words, attributing their behaviour, their criticism of science, to malice, when you could attribute it to ignorance or incompetence. And if they are truly ignorant, why is it their fault? Perhaps they haven't been educated. If you genuinely know more than they do, why not educate them? And at this point, a lot of progressives say, oh, I don't have the time for this, it triggers me. And I want to make a side note here. Unless you have PTSD or a mental illness, you haven't been triggered. Getting offended is not being triggered. I can tell you what disabling mental illness looks like. Professionally and personally, I've had plenty of experience that puts me in a position to be able to speak on that with authority. Just because someone says they don't trust science, it doesn't trigger you. But that's an approximation of what you hear. I don't have time for this. So you're willing to advocate science when it suits you, but when someone else might be genuinely ignorant and you think you know better, I don't have time to explain it to them. Educate yourself, they often say. I mentioned before that often progressivism, when in its most extreme manifestations, tends to facilitate avoidance coping. In the past, I have discussed how in different political ideologies, the solution to what a particular group perceives to be a problem in society is to ban things. Banning books, banning statues, banning games, banning particular activities, banning certain words, and even having criminal repercussions for saying certain words in public. I've also spoken briefly in the past about how we're constantly lowering our standards about how we behave at work and what we're expected to be able to do in order to pass educational courses. I can't say that these are all necessarily progressive initiatives. As I've said, politicians claim to be progressive, but when politicians institute changes, really they're just doing it for their own benefits, not yours. But often it's progressives who believe them to be good things. This is not a scientific way to live life. As I've said in the past, the information processing model, which is the best theory that we have to explain how the mind processes information, when you understand that, okay, actual psychological science, when you understand that, you soon see that you cannot conclude that just because a child or someone else is exposed to one word or one statue or one idea, or even on a number of occasions, that it's going to turn them into a horrible person or it's going to instill bad values in them. The information processing model shows us there are a number of different influences that the brain considers at an unconscious level when deciding to take a particular point of view or when formulating certain ideas, certain beliefs. And what you'll actually find is that one of the best ways to teach someone the right values is to expose them to the bad that exists in the world and tell them, you see this? These are the bad things that can happen when you believe the wrong ideas. But if you believe the right ideas, you have a fighting chance of not falling subject to it. Again, it happens on the right as well, but there is a distinct phenomenon in progressive politics against debate. There is a lot of progressive politics shutting down debate, telling people, I don't need to debate you, you get censored, I get to speak my mind. And it often does happen. Not necessarily, not saying it explicitly, but implying by their logic that if you do not agree with this idea, you must be a bad person because the idea that I'm advocating for here is objectively correct. There's no other way to interpret reality. This idea is objective good, and if you don't agree with it, you must be a bad person. Again, science does not advocate this idea, okay? Real science doesn't. Because when we understand psychology, we understand the brain processes and distorts information in a very complex fashion. It is impossible to know exactly how objective your perception is. And often, when you shut down someone and you react to someone with anger, that negative emotional state is actually biasing you to interpret everything they say as bad, so that even if they are saying something valid, you're less likely to understand the validity in it. Again, psychological science, actual science demonstrates this. That's another form of avoidance coping, not wanting to discuss any ideas that make you uncomfortable. The best way to survive well, and the best way to actually make the most of your life, is to take personal agency. A lot of progressive philosophies, like in socialism or sociology or similar philosophies, actually advocate we don't have personal agency, life controls us, the society controls us. But if you accept that as an absolute, you are actually precluding yourself from seeing all the ways that you do have control. This is something I'll explore in the future more. And then that will become a reality because you've been brainwashed into thinking you don't have control. Let me ask you something. If you genuinely believe society is oppressive, and someone who is significantly more privileged than you, is earning six figures in an academic position, is telling you you don't really have personal choice, society controls you. Let me ask you something. How much do you really think they have your best interest in mind? I can tell you they don't. If anyone tells you you don't have choices in life, that is someone who wants the worst for you. That is someone who wants you to believe that because they want you kept helpless and ignorant. We don't have all the choices in the world, but the best results in life come when you actively acknowledge what choices you do have and put effort in and sacrifice to actualize your best, your personal best. Avoiding what makes you uncomfortable doesn't help that. Confronting it does. Absolutely shutting down to everything that you disagree with or that makes you even remotely uncomfortable is not scientific. It's what authoritarians want you to do to keep us divided. All right, again, if you're anti-authority, you have to acknowledge that historically speaking, authority has not had people's best interest in mind. Authority is a pathological pursuit. The only way to really know if you're being objective is to test your beliefs by constantly being exposed to new information and not accepting it on face value, but really analysing it rationally, analysing it critically and in detail. And again, it's not necessarily your fault. You may have been indoctrinated into thinking that if you just avoid people who disagree with you, that you'll have a good life and you'll be a good person. Okay, now let's turn our attention to conservative or right-wing politics. Now, the major focus of conservative politics tends to be obedience to conventional norms of a given society and structures and societal systems that allow those norms to operate and perpetuate them. Some of the most common of those norms in the West might be personal responsibility and structures such as a free economic market, whereby people have the freedom to engage in business transactions and people are ultimately responsible for regulating themselves, how those transactions take place, and also taking responsibility for the consequences. They might be that people should get to keep what they earn, so favouring lower tax, but also offering less, if any, social assistance from the government. Having more stringent criminal laws so that people are held accountable for their actions. Having more personal freedoms in some regards. Advocating that standards for behaviour and achievement should be kept high and that people should be made to compete to achieve those standards so that people achieve their personal best by constantly striving for more. Conventional family structures and gender structures, obedience to traditions such as religions that guide behaviour, and ultimately the belief that when we abide certain standards that it provides us an objective means of determining what we should and shouldn't do in life. Now again, the idea of standards in its place and when practiced well is an adaptive one. It certainly has its purpose and it's certainly important. Unfortunately, when taken in its most extreme sense, or indeed in the populist, sensationalist sense, conservative politics does, like leftist politics, have its own problems. When taken far enough, it can be animalistic and it can be rather lacking in compassion at times. It assumes that humans are just like every other animal and we function purely off instinct, and hence if we just blindly conform to certain standards, we blindly follow tradition without questioning anything, then we should have no problems in life. Because personal satisfaction shouldn't matter if you just follow the rules strictly and don't think about it and just put your head down and do what you're meant to do what you're told, we wouldn't have problems. Which tends to be a rather oversimplification of the human existence. Because as we know, conformity doesn't always work. And people do have natural needs for personal satisfaction, to find personal satisfaction in what they do, and not everybody has the same aspirations. With that in mind, let's look at some of the common inconsistencies. One of the most common conservative talking points in the media and in politics tends to be regarding people's purpose in life and how hard they're willing to work. Often you'll hear conservatives discussing that people need real purpose in life and that modern society has made people lazy, incompetent, and ultimately made them surrender to hedonism, to decadence. That people are only doing what they do now for personal pleasure. They don't have a sense of sacrifice. They don't have real purpose. People don't live to work anymore. They don't have values. They're weak. They're constantly complaining. They don't want to work anymore. They don't want to do anything for themselves. They constantly want society to take care of them. And they're constantly tending to their feelings. They're too emotionally sensitive. They need to constantly be validated. Let's examine again some of the main pundits who advocate for these ideas. And what to also keep in mind is that a lot of these people are men. Not to say that only men do it, but a lot of these people are men. And even the women advocate for traditional masculine values, being stoic, being unemotional, saying that men shouldn't be emotional. They also tend to fetishize somewhat people who serve in emergency services and in the military. Well, let's examine a lot of these pundits. A lot of them themselves don't have jobs that abide those values. They're not tradesmen. They don't make or fix anything. They don't heal people. Most of them have never served in the military or the police force or emergency services. What they do is they sit behind computers all day creating content that consists of nothing more than their opinions. And often, when you look at how much resentment they have towards society and towards people who have different opinions, and especially how much resentment they have towards people who do have the courage to ask for emotional care, you see just how emotionally insecure they are, but also you see how little value what they do has. In the end, what they do has no tangible benefit to people other than validating opinions. You start to see the double standard. Isn't sitting behind a computer all day complaining on the internet to people just for the sake of validating your opinions, which people, by the way, don't go into those jobs, those media jobs, for any other purpose than to have their opinions validated? Isn't that a sign of insecurity? Weren't you just saying 5 minutes ago that lefties are weak and that they're always looking for validation? And weren't you saying that men should be stoic and secure in themselves? How secure are you if what you do for a living is take money from people to validate their opinions, they themselves who must be insecure in order to want to pay money to have their opinions validated? And at the same time, if it's always the youngsters or the left who are always complaining and are always ungrateful, why are you not setting an example for them? Your entire job, again, revolves around being on the internet, complaining about life. And in fact, a lot of these people will specifically seek content off the internet and off social media involving specific people so that they can complain about them. These people don't care about how society operates. They are insecure. They are looking for a punching bag. They're bullies. And again, what enhances this is a lot of conservative male pundits are talking about weak men. They talk about soy boy beta cuckolds saying men these days are weak. If you choose a job that involves complaining all day and bullying people, then you yourself must be weak, especially considering you are hypocritical enough to receive money from people who themselves are weak and are looking for your validation. In reality, a lot of the people who become brainwashed by this content themselves don't have much purpose in life. And they're looking for a purpose, they're looking for validation. And they see purpose because these conservative pundits tell them exactly what they want to hear. They make them feel better about themselves. And even the people who aren't in the media, even the ones who do have proper jobs, again, you're not secure if you constantly have to beat up on people intellectually in order to feel good about yourself. And in fact, as much as they complain about values and standards, you would be surprised how many right-wingers don't have a purpose in life, spend their time playing video games, a form of Western decadence, using drugs, and ultimately doing things that have no tangible benefit to themselves or society, things that aren't wholesome. What's especially concerning is when you see these people making fun of other individuals who are troubled. Often, again, they'll look on the internet for things that make them angry because they want to be angry, which again exemplifies they're not emotionally controlled, they're not stoic, they are themselves emotionally insecure and unstable, and they're looking for a reason to be angry. It makes them feel good about themselves. But they will look for people on the internet who are perhaps of left-wing political persuasion, people who may well have troubles in their life, people who may be mentally ill, or people who may have adopted some lifestyle choices that aren't necessarily in their best interest, and they will laugh at them. Let me tell you something. If someone's troubled, there's no reason to laugh at them. That's cruelty. Some people have genuinely been misguided into making not so favourable lifestyle choices. They need guidance, and they need guidance in good faith. Again, when you make this clear to them, they often say, oh, I do care. I'm telling people what they need to hear. A lot of conservatives also deny that they were intending to offend anyone. I can tell you all sensationalist media, in other words, most media, is intended to offend someone. It's intended to play on people's emotions. They are looking for emotional attention. As a related topic, one of the values that they'll often preach is self-reliance. And they'll often say, people should know how to do things for themselves. You shouldn't expect society to do anything for you. But often, you'll see these men who don't even know how to maintain a home or don't know how to do anything with their hands. Often they'll downplay it. They'll laugh and say, oh, well, I don't know how to use the washing machine, but don't worry, my wife can take care of it. And also remember that in the most strict traditional marriages, women don't have power, they don't have an income, they don't have any financial backing. So if the husband decides to either leave or abuse the family, there's not much the woman can do. How much do you really value independence if you're basically content to live a life where there are things you don't know how to do and you're happy for your wife to be reliant on you? That is not independence. And as I've argued, everyone should know how to do as much as they can for themselves, regardless of who or what you are. Now, on the subject of values, let's examine the supposed conservative concern for the family and for children. Saying that gender transitions are bad and dangerous, but circumcision is encouraged for religious purposes is again hypocrisy. I am not a doctor. I can't say what all the risks are specifically in each type of operation, but suffice to say that if a person is willing to say that performing gender transitions on children is a pedophilic and toxic agenda to try and groom the children for political purposes, but they're absolutely okay with genital mutilation, and that's what I maintain circumcision is, genital mutilation, then there's clear hypocrisy there. Conservatives often engage in what I refer to as child worship, which means they consider having children to be an absolute duty that you have to nature, that it's absolute sanctity, and that you're not an optimal person of optimal virtue unless you have children. There are a lot of reasons why people may choose not to have children. Some don't have the financial means. Some don't feel they have the right personal qualities. Some just don't want to. And if you don't want to do something, then you'll never be optimal at it. And you may end up being an ineffective parent that could harm the child in the long term. A lot of these fundamentalist conservatives will say, well, you have a duty to be a parent. If you don't have a child, then you have not fully actualized as an adult. Voluntary childlessness is bad. But if somebody was to actually take that advice, then to have children and then find, I'm not cut out for this, that same conservative would then be criticizing, well, that's your fault. You should grow up and learn to be a better parent. And that in combination with their stance against abortion to state that life absolutely begins at conception and that you should not be able to have an abortion under any circumstances, ignores the complexity of what happens when a woman falls pregnant. They'll say, well, why did you have sex if you didn't want to fall pregnant? There are a number of reasons why people have intimate relations. Sometimes contraception can fail. Sometimes people are raped. And they'll say, yes, that's an edge case. But some people still maintain that even if you're raped, you shouldn't be forced to have the child, which, often will go into foster care or the adoption system, which you ask anyone who's been involved in those systems and you ask them how easy a ride it is for the child. And a conservative will gladly say you should have children without any exception, and abortion should never be allowed under any exception. But then when the child is suffering, oh, why should my taxes be used to pay for welfare programs? And by the way, if you're actually pro-life, think long and hard before saying next time, I'm happy for my government to send our innocent soldiers overseas to fight wars that have nothing to do with us. They will wax lyrical that all pedophilic rhetoric is from the left, and yet a lot of right-wing ideologies allow child marriages, allow women to be used. They never mention that. They'll criticize other cultures who do it, but when their own culture does it, they never mention it. They'll say that family is most important, but how well do some of these people actually treat their families? Some of them say, the minute my child turns 18, they're out on their own. It's natural order. Got to learn to fend for yourself, suck it up and deal with it. That's their philosophy. In fact, it actually ties into a much broader philosophy that tends to manifest in right-wing politics, which is life is either you step on someone else or you get stepped on. As I was saying before, one of their talking points is having real purpose in life, and a lot of them believe you should live to work, that you should basically be a slave to your boss, and that the government shouldn't have the right to institute laws facilitating work-life balance or to facilitate fair working conditions. In the end, the libertarian philosophy is, well, I have mine, why should the government tell me how to run my business? If you don't like your job, you can just quit, and if you starve, that's your problem. If you spend your entire life at the office, how are you going to have time for your family? In fact, a lot of these people will criticize fatherless families. They'll say, oh, fathers don't spend enough time with their kids anymore. A father figure is important in the family, but there you are advocating for employers to be able to exploit the man of the family who is working so that he never has time to spend with his wife and children. And a major hypocritical point here, is when these people complain about others not taking personal responsibility and being emotionally unstable, but then when they show emotional instability in their families, especially in a way that ends up being psychologically or physically abusive towards their wife or their children, often they come out with the excuse of, well, it's not my fault, I'm a man, society taught me to deal with my demons this way, it's not my fault. Okay, so every other problem that's caused in society is a result of other people not taking personal responsibility. But when you make a major mistake like abusing people, which, to be perfectly frank, is not a mistake, it's just bad faith, you take it upon yourself to quickly externalize it. Every now and again, what I also see on the internet are stories of a child's belongings being broken by one of their parents as a punishment. And there are some people who will always ring in with their opinion of, well, if they were willing to break something that belonged to you, then you must have done something to deserve it. They bought it for you. It's their house, their rules. This is inconsistent with a number of major conservative talking points. Conservatives are saying that other people, the left, are always emotionally immature and emotionally unstable. They'll also say the kids these days have no gratitude. There are people starving in the world. If you had gratitude, why are you breaking things? And if you are truly emotionally mature, why do you feel the need to break something to make a point? I'm not going to say whether this is the right way to discipline a child or not. That's a different issue. But if you truly practice what you preach, here's what you do. You take that belonging, you give it to charity, and you say, if you're not going to behave yourself, then I'm going to give this to someone who really appreciates it. That is the ultimate correct way to discipline someone if you're going to follow the ethos of punishment. When you demonstrate emotional instability, that is not you being tough, that is not you being a strong, loving hand, that is you being uncontrolled, immature, undisciplined, and ultimately someone who will not take responsibility for their own actions. And if you came into my practice because you had enacted emotionally abusive behaviours, yes, you would be absolutely treated with respect and compassion, but ultimately, as a counsellor, it is my job to tell you what you're doing is objectively bad, it will hurt you, it will hurt other people, and I'm not going to sit here sugarcoating things and being politically correct, as you like to say the rest of the world is, by telling you there, it's all right. I'm going to make you work, and I'm going to challenge you to set goals for yourself to be a good person, because I know you are capable of it. All right? In the end, we are all capable of being good people, and if you truly believe that it's only our choices that result in our position in life, then practice that philosophy by making the right choices yourself and not being emotionally abusive or physically abusive. Now, another major talking point from conservative politics is the slippery slope argument, the idea that if our societal standards are allowed to become too lax, then eventually they will become increasingly lax and eventually society will be disorderly. The slippery slope argument is often used to argue why leftist authoritarianism is bad and that how it will eventually result in people having fewer and fewer rights. But there are plenty of conservatives who will deny that tightening people's rights in the way that they think is appropriate will result in further violations. For example, a lot of conservatives will say, well, just because we ban abortions, it doesn't mean that we're going to ban homosexuality, because homosexuality doesn't involve murder. There is a clear boundary, a clear differentiation between killing a human fetus and consensually loving someone of the same sex. And yet there are people in the world who are anti-abortion and who also want to ban homosexuality and who have tried that. And apparently there are places where it's being tried, even in the West. It's usually, not always, but usually from right-wing politics where the idea that hitting children as punishment is acceptable. Okay, let's use the slippery slope logic. When does that become assault? If you insult my partner in public, when does it become okay for me to hit you? If you abuse your child and your child grows up to be big and strong enough to hit you back in a way that seriously injures you, should that be allowed? They'll say that the left are too authoritarian, they preach freedom, but they're okay with banning, for example, pornography, books that mention, say, homosexual families. They're okay with banning sex work, gay marriage, but at the same time, they'll argue old books won't turn children racist, or old statues won't children racist. They should be kept because they're a part of our history, and you should be able to tell any offensive joke you want. But then when it comes to some of these more liberal ideas like pornography and sex work and gay marriage, etc., they'll say, oh, these things will harm kids. It's objective and science says so, therefore we should ban it. Again, see my arguments regarding progressive laws that ban things. Because the idea that pornography is the same as, say, a strong narcotic drug in terms of its mental effects, yes, there may be comparisons. Yes, there may be similar mental effects, but pornography is not an intoxicant, right? And it's not going to turn you bad. You still have choices about what you do with pornography. With regards to virtue, you'll hear a lot of conservatives calling the left miserable, pessimistic, nihilistic people who want to make other people miserable with them. But look at populist conservative philosophy that we've discussed. When taken to an extreme, the philosophy is you have a duty to do exactly what society tells you to do, to have children, to raise them harshly, to fulfill societal roles. And if it makes you miserable, too bad. And then your kids have a duty to do the same. Many of them, when they're complaining, present as extremely bitter, pessimistic, and ultimately resentful of society. And I look into a lot of conservative pundits' eyes, all right? I've spent a lot of time analysing political rhetoric. I can see into them. They did not have good childhoods. They were raised not to care about themselves. They were raised not to believe that their feelings are acceptable and that they should emotionally tend to themselves. They were raised to be hard, unfeeling people and to basically hate others. Many of them were probably beaten or abused by their parents. And now when they see other people calling for parents to respect their children, they get bitter because they know that they weren't afforded that same respect. I feel for you, but you making this someone else's problem and basically wanting the world to be as miserable as you are is not acceptable. Often it's conservatives that condemn hedonism and decadence. They say the world is falling to pieces because people are constantly looking to tend to their desires without tending to their duties. This tends to also conflict with the true utility of their religious beliefs. Many conservatives smoke and drink. Smoking and drinking is quite decadent. If you genuinely respect your particular religious figure, why would you want to abuse your body? Our Creator gave us one body, so why are you willing to waste it? And plus, despite the harm that smoking can cause, and potentially drinking, I don't hear conservatives wanting to ban that. I don't hear them wanting to ban other luxuries as well, like gambling and horse racing. Aren't those also addictive, like pornography, which they want to ban? At the same time, I don't see them wanting to ban influencers. In fact, many right-wingers are influencers, but again, aren't they a sign of Western decadence? When taken in its most extreme form, it blatantly can lack compassion. For example, there are some extreme libertarians who don't believe in any type of social assistance. They say, you don't have a right to be taken care of. My taxes should not be used to pay for your health care, even if you've done everything right in life and it's not your fault that what happened to you, too bad. You find your own assistance. You do not have a right to my taxes. First of all, I have to question whether the person who says that would actually react the same way if they were poor, broke, and didn't have money to pay for, say, cancer treatment. When you make arguments to the effect of, oh, there's always plenty of private charity to help you, if these capitalist ideals were actualized, where would private charity get the money? How many people would actually be willing to donate to them? It's a question that you need to ask, because it's easy to say, well, there'd be plenty of people willing to donate. How do you know? Currently, a lot of people don't have the money to donate themselves. There are also some rather misguided views on mental health in extremist right-wing politics. You'll often hear pundits saying, all these new mental illnesses don't really exist. They're just made up because professionals want to charge you for services. This explosion of mental illness is really just people justifying bad standards in society. This didn't happen in my day. People just want excuses for being lazy and incompetent. Well, I've explained in my past content and will continue to why mental illness is real, so we can instantly negate that argument. There's a curiosity here that often these people would say to the effect that being autistic is no excuse not to know how to behave in society. If your blunt honesty offends people, then you should learn to be more socially acceptable. Autism is no excuse. But then a lot of these people will be rather abrupt in the way they express ideas and then say, well, it's not my fault that you don't like the truth. A lot of these people will say experiences like depression and anxiety are just parts of the human experiences. If we call them mental illnesses, we're just over-pathologizing. Well, let me ask you something. These people will say that if you choose to be childless, then you're a degenerate, even though choice is part of the human experience. So if someone truly lacks the ability to function because of their mental illness, is considered by some right-wingers to be just feigning illness, then how is it consistent to also say that somebody practicing personal responsibility, which again you claim to support, by avoiding a life choice which they can't really manage, like having children, how can they be degenerate? Many are against the right to euthanasia, saying you have a duty to suffer. I shouldn't have to explain why that lacks compassion. There tends to be a lot of people who genuinely believe that life is just one big conflict. They see conflict as necessary. Now, conflict in life is inevitable, but ultimately we cause it, right? We cause it by our own behaviours. And instead of taking it upon themselves to be a ray of hope amongst a world of injustice, they say, well, life is one big conflict, therefore I can justify being adversarial. And they even seem to fetishize conflict, like in the way that they say that soldiers are war heroes. They use the word hero. Now, I'm not denying the bravery and the dedication of people who serve in the military, but again, how much do you really respect military personnel when you're happy to send them overseas to fight wars that have nothing to do with us and again are caused by corrupt humans, but then when they return, oh, why should my taxes be used to pay for welfare programs for veterans? Another point I'd like to make is that a lot of not all of it, but a lot of anti-pet propaganda comes from the right. There are actually people who say that the proliferation of people owning pets instead of children, or people who have children and have also pets and treat their pets like they would treat a member of the family. There are a lot of conservatives that call this degenerate behaviour. They say, oh, it's people having a lack of standards that cause them to respect animals as if they're humans. They say animals aren't great like people say they are. They're not intelligent like people say they are. And you shouldn't be treating them like humans. Okay, I'm not going to stigmatise people who don't like animals. right? You may have a genuine reason to. Maybe you just don't feel comfortable around them. Maybe you've been traumatized by animals before. Maybe you've been attacked by a dog. If you are willing to say, you should be obedient to my conservative beliefs, and my beliefs say that we have a creator and we have a duty to our creator and that life is a miracle and that we have a duty to be compassionate and have values and have standards. If you believe all that, but then you're willing to basically say that animals don't have a moral standing and that they can't be good and that they can't be virtuous and that we shouldn't love animals the same way we love humans, being God's creations, okay, God's special creations for a purpose, you're willing to project your bitterness onto those around you by saying, it's not me who's a problem, it's other people who are a problem for loving their animals. And taking something as innocent and as pure as the love that someone might have for animals and the love that an animal might have for another species. All right? If something bad has happened to you, I'm sorry. And you deserve compassion and you deserve help. But part of that change process, if you truly want to be a good person and you truly want to improve, involves looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, you know what, I have to work on my bitterness and I have to acknowledge that that is mine. All right? It's not the rest of the world's problem that I was in a bad situation. Whatever happened, happened. It wasn't my fault, but now I have to take responsibility for what I say to other people and for how I treat people. If you truly want to be the strong man that you claim to be, or a strong, independent person with virtue and values, that's what you have to do. Not everything is as cut and dried as simple traditions like to make it out to be. Our mind and life are more complex than we like to think. Well, we like to think we understand everything. We like to think that we have a grasp on absolutely everything in nature, but we don't. Life is more complex. And oversimplifying everything is not us being truthful. It's us not being willing to engage with the pure breadth of what exists in the world. Not everything in life is a simple choice. Okay, if you are still with me after I've just essentially offended all of the human race, I thank you. I hope you heeded my advice and paid attention to the details there. What can we see here? What we can see is that our beliefs are often oversimplified. Often we believe things just because we want to feel we're right. But as humans, we cannot know everything. We cannot know everything objectively. And we cannot say that any belief system that a mere human invents can possibly capture reality. I've criticized a lot of ideas in today's episode. It's not to say that any of those ideas weren't important. It's not to say that some of those ideas didn't even have validity. What I am saying here, though, is that if our ideas are to be truthful and practiced for intellectual honesty, they must be logically consistent. And ultimately, to expand our knowledge, we can't just stay in an echo chamber. We can't constantly just talk to and hear from people who agree with us. We have to be exposed to what exists in the world. And you know what? I've made plenty of the cognitive mistakes that I've mentioned in today's episode. And I may be making cognitive mistakes myself. I may be mistaken in some of my beliefs. I don't know. I try to be objective. I try to examine myself regularly, but I can't know everything. And that's one of the reasons why the Your Listener podcast even exists, because it's given me the opportunity to collaborate with people who have different perspectives, to share their experiences, to educate me as much as I educate them. And I'm going to invite people right now, if you have heard something today with which you agree or disagree, but especially if you disagree, come onto the program. I'm not looking for people with big personalities or with a lot of money or support to give. I'm looking for people who have something to say and who are happy to say it and act in good faith. And as long as that's you, you are welcome to contact me. And I would very much welcome you to contact me and give me the opportunity to listen to your story, listen to what you have to say on a topic. Educate me. Something that I'll say about counseling is that my clients teach me as much as I teach them. I get to hear other people's experience, and often that informs my future practice. The real world is the real world. That's where you learn the most. And I absolutely love hearing from other people and hearing about their experiences because it gives me the opportunity to examine my own beliefs and ask, is this really true or am I biased? And if I'm biased, how can I correct that bias? So I thank everyone for joining me for today's episode, and I would like to remind everyone that what you hear in the media or on the internet is not advice. So if you have concerns of yourself or you need further information, consult with a professional, find someone you trust. And remember that criticizing ideas doesn't mean calling people who may believe them a bad person. And I very much encourage, genuinely, whoever you may be, if you disagree with something or you have something to say, contact me and I would love to hear from you. I'm looking forward in the future to having more people be a guest on my program, to collaborate with me, to talk about topics of interest to them, and to challenge me. I love being challenged. I love getting to critically examine ideas. There is nothing more intellectually stimulating than that. And until next time, everyone, please take care of yourselves.